All right, so today we're diving headfirst into Silicon Valley real estate. We've got some really interesting sources here about buying and selling in tech's biggest playground. Think bidding wars, crazy high prices, and a market that pretty much plays by its own rules.
Yeah, the influence the tech industry has on housing here is unbelievable. We're not just talking about employees needing a roof over their head. It's the whole shebang. High salaries, those stock options everyone's after, and a constant flow of new talent. All of that just cranks up the pressure on real estate.
So it's not just that tech workers need homes, it's that they can afford places most people wouldn't even dream of. This isn't your typical market, right?
Not even close. When your average tech worker is bringing in a hefty paycheck, often with stock options on top of that, it throws the usual market dynamics out the window. It's like this cycle that feeds itself. Tech does well, salaries go up, and that just fuels even more demand for housing.
Speaking of crazy demand, let's talk about those price tags. Our sources mention Palo Alto's median home price is over $3 million? $3 million, is that even real?
Sadly, it is. The median home price in Palo Alto right now is hovering around 3.2 million. To put that in perspective, that's more than double the national median, and places like Mountain View and Cupertino aren't that far behind.
So double the national average. Ouch. But why is location so important? Is it all about being near those big tech campuses?
It's a huge factor, especially when you consider how notorious Bay Area traffic is. A lot of tech employees are happy to pay a premium to live closer to work, just to shave some time off their commute.
So basically, the closer you are to Google, the more your house is worth. That's kind of wild, isn't it?
There's definitely a connection there. One of the sources actually pointed to a study that found homes within a mile of major tech campuses. Those homes go for way more than houses just a few miles further out. It's like a super localized thing driven by this desire to be in the heart of it all.
Wow, so it's like a tech premium on top of the already insane Bay Area prices. I'm starting to get why people talk about houses being snapped up within hours of being listed.
It's not unusual, especially when you're talking about those sought-after places in prime spots. And it's not just the speed either, it's how fierce the competition gets. We're talking offers way above asking price, buyers ditching contingencies, even writing personal letters to sellers trying to stand out.
Contingencies, sorry to interrupt, but can you explain that a bit? I'm imagining some pretty intense contract stuff.
Good point. Contingencies are basically conditions that need to be met before the sale goes through. Common ones are things like a home inspection or getting your mortgage approved. In a red-hot market like this, buyers might waive some of these contingencies to sweeten the deal for the seller, but that could be a risky move.
So they're basically saying, I want this house so bad I'm willing to skip some of the usual safety checks. Talk about a high-stakes game.
Exactly. It shows you just how competitive things are. And for those who aren't pulling in tech-level salaries, it's a serious uphill battle to get a foot in the door.
That makes sense. So if you're not a software engineer or a venture capitalist, are you basically out of luck?
Not completely out of luck, but it's definitely an uphill climb. We're talking first-time buyers, families who've been in the area forever. All of them are trying to compete with the buying power of the tech industry.
It's not just confined to Silicon Valley proper, is it? This ripple effect is pushing outward, making housing less affordable in the surrounding areas too. Didn't one of the sources mention something about Fremont?
You got it. Well, Fremont used to be the more affordable option. The average house price there now is over 1.5 million. But here's where it gets interesting. The source breaks it down further. New townhomes in Fremont are actually seeing much higher price increases compared to older, detached homes.
So even within a city like Fremont, there are these micro trends playing out,
Right.
driven by what buyers are after and what developers are building.
Exactly. It suggests a shift in the Fremont market, maybe with buyers looking more for new builds, perhaps even a lifestyle that's a bit less car-dependent, even if it comes with a higher price tag.
It's kind of mind-blowing how this tech influence is shaping entire communities, even those outside of the traditional Silicon Valley borders. It's not just about prices, it's about what kind of housing gets built, where, and for who.
It raises a big question. If even places like Fremont are getting priced out, where do people go? It's pushing some residents further and further out, making their commutes longer, and potentially impacting their quality of life.
That's a sobering thought. It's like this housing pressure cooker, and everyone's trying to figure out how to handle it. Okay, so we've painted this picture of an intense market, but let's talk about what it actually means to be a buyer here. What should someone be prepared for?
Well, the first piece of advice might sound obvious, but it's crucial.
Hmm.
Get pre-approved for a mortgage. In this market, speed is everything, and sellers want to know you're serious and ready to close quickly. But even beyond that, there's some strategic things to consider.
Hold on, even with pre-approval, you're still up against those all-cash offers and people waiving contingencies, right? How can anyone compete with that?
That's where having a good local real estate agent comes in. They understand the ins and outs of the Silicon Valley market, and they can help buyers put together a competitive offer, even if it means thinking outside the box.
So it's not just about having the money, it's about knowing how to play the game. You need a strategy, not just a dream of owning a place.
Exactly. Speaking of strategy, let's flip things around for a second and look at it from the seller's perspective. Imagine putting your house up for sale, and suddenly you're juggling multiple offers, all above asking price. Sounds like a dream, right?
It does. But I have a feeling it's not always that straightforward. Is there more to it than just sticking a for sale sign out front?
Absolutely. Even when it's a seller's market, being prepared is crucial. The source material actually highlights a case where a home in Palo Alto, even though it was in a prime location, just sat on the market for weeks, all because the seller had set the price way too high.
Wait, seriously, so even in this crazy market, you can't just throw out any number and expect buyers to come running?
That's the thing. Buyers in Silicon Valley are smart. They do their homework, they know what things are worth, and they won't hesitate to walk away if they think a property's overpriced.
So even if you're selling in a hot market, you still need a game plan. That's fascinating. Okay, ready for another perspective shift. Let's talk about investors. What are they seeing in this market, and what are some of the challenges they're up against?
Well, the high demand and rising prices are obviously a big draw for investors. The potential for long-term gains is huge. But the source material also points out some key hurdles. The cost of getting into the market is sky high, and the competition is fierce, even for seasoned investors.
So high risk, high reward, but for those who are ready to jump in, what are some of the strategies they might consider? Are we just talking about buying and holding on to single-family homes?
That's one approach, but not the only one. The source mentions a growing trend of investors looking past single-family homes towards multifamily properties and even mixed-use developments.
Hold on, mixed-use developments, like combining residential with commercial spaces. Why would investors be interested in that?
It's a way to spread their investments and maybe tap into a market that's a bit less cutthroat. Yeah. For example, the source mentions a few investors who are creating properties that combine ground floor retail space with apartments above. It creates a built-in tenant base and a more reliable income stream.
That's pretty smart. It's like creating a mini ecosystem within the development itself. It sounds like investors are really having to get creative to find opportunities in this market.
Absolutely. And that creativity is key, especially when you think about the long term. I mean, will this tech-fueled frenzy last forever, or are there signs that things might shift?
All right, let's hear your predictions. What's in store for Silicon Valley real estate?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but
Come on, give us the inside scoop. What should we be paying attention to?
okay. Let's dive into some potential future trends when we come back for part 2 of this deep dive. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to our deep dive on the Silicon Valley housing market. I'm still trying to get my head around those crazy prices and the competition. But right before the break, we were starting to talk about what's on the horizon. You mentioned some trends we should be keeping an eye on.
Yes, the tech industry definitely has a huge impact, no doubt. But there are other factors at play that could really shape the future of this market. One of the biggest is the rise of remote work.
Okay, remote work. We hear so much about it these days. But how could that actually affect the Silicon Valley housing scene? Wouldn't people still want to live close to those innovation hubs?
It's an interesting question, and our sources actually dig into this pretty deeply. If more tech companies decide to go all in on remote work, that whole geographic concentration we were talking about could start to shift.
So instead of everyone crowding around those big tech campuses, we might see people moving out to areas that are more affordable. I guess that could take some of the heat off those crazy prices in Palo Alto.
Exactly. If employees aren't glued to an office 5 days a week, that premium you pay for being close to those campuses might not be as big a deal. It could lead to a more balanced market overall.
But wouldn't that be bad news for people who already own homes in those prime locations? I mean, wouldn't their property values take a hit?
It's a valid concern. And the sources acknowledge that if there's a major shift in demand, it could impact property values. But it's not necessarily all doom and gloom.
Okay, so what should homeowners in those areas be thinking about with this potential shift? Should they be worried?
Instead of worrying, I think the key is to stay in the loop and be flexible. Keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the tech world and see how companies are handling those remote work policies. It's also important to remember that real estate is a long game. even if there are ups and downs in the short term. Silicon Valley is still a really desirable place to live.
So it's about having a balanced view, understanding the potential risks and also the opportunities. But remote work isn't the only thing that could shake things up, is it?
No way. We also have to factor in the bigger economic picture. Interest rates, for instance, play a huge role in affordability.
Oh, yeah, interest rates, they've definitely been going up lately. How could that impact the Silicon Valley housing market?
Well, when interest rates climb, borrowing money gets more expensive. Yeah. Which can directly affect how much buyers can actually afford.
So even if those tech salaries stay high, rising interest rates could make it tougher for people to swing those million-dollar homes.
Exactly. It could cool down demand to a certain extent,
Yeah.
especially for those higher-priced properties.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like a balancing act. High salaries pushing prices up on one side, and rising interest rates potentially pulling them back down on the other.
You nailed it. And it just shows that the Silicon Valley housing market is influenced by this whole web of different factors.
All right, so we've got remote work and interest rates to keep in mind. What else should we be watching for?
The source material also talks about how important government policies and regulations are. Things like zoning laws, building codes, and those affordable housing initiatives. They can all have a big impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. If it's harder to build new houses, that would keep the supply low and prices high.
Exactly. And on the flip side, if there are policies that encourage building more affordable housing, it could help ease some of the pressure on the market.
So it's not just about the forces of the market itself, it's also about how local governments decide to handle growth and development.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue with no simple solutions.
Wow, this is making my head spin. So much to think about, but I really appreciate you breaking it all down.
It's important to understand what's going on. So whether you're a buyer, a seller, or an investor, you can make smart decisions.
Speaking of making smart decisions, let's get back to the practical side of things. We talked about the challenges buyers face in this market. But what are some tips they can use to navigate this competitive landscape?
We mentioned getting pre-approved earlier, but it's worth repeating. Getting that pre-approval for a mortgage is absolutely crucial. It shows sellers that you're serious and can move quickly.
Okay, pre-approval, check. What else? Is it even worth trying to negotiate in a market this hot?
Negotiation is always worth a shot, but you got to be strategic about it. The source material actually suggests focusing on things that aren't as important to the seller, like maybe the closing date or some flexibility with moving in.
So find something they're willing to budge on, instead of trying to haggle over the price itself. I guess that makes sense in a market where buyers hold most of the card.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to walk away if a deal just doesn't feel right. There will always be other opportunities.
That's good advice. It's easy to get caught up in all the excitement, but it's important to remember that buying a home is a huge decision.
Absolutely. And speaking of big decisions, let's talk about sellers for a minute. We know it's a seller's market, but are there any common mistakes they should try to avoid?
I'm all ears. I can imagine it's tempting to get a little greedy when you're getting multiple offers above asking price.
You're not wrong. Overpricing is a classic mistake. Even in a hot market, buyers are still looking for a good deal.
So how do you strike that balance between getting the most profit and not scaring off potential buyers?
Research is your best friend. Look at similar properties in your area and work with a real estate agent who really knows the local market.
Makes sense. It's like anything else. You need to know what you're worth.
Precisely. And don't underestimate the power of presentation. Staging your home and making sure it's in tip-top shape can really make a difference.
Okay, so even though buyers are practically lining up, sellers still need to put in the work.
It's all about maximizing your return on investment. Speaking of return on investment, let's bring it back to those investors.
Yes, let's talk about those folks who are trying to make the most of this Silicon Valley real estate boom. What are some of the key things they should be aware of?
One thing to be careful of is just blindly following the hype. Just because prices have been going up steadily doesn't mean it'll last forever.
So don't get swept up in all the excitement. Do your research and make smart choices.
Exactly. Another potential red flag is over-leveraging. With those high property values, it's tempting to borrow a lot, but that can be a risky move if the market cools down or those interest rates start climbing.
It's all about finding that sweet spot between potential rewards and the risks involved.
Precisely. And as we've talked about throughout this whole deep dive, being able to adapt is crucial. The Silicon Valley real estate market is a living, breathing thing. It's always changing, influenced by so many different factors.
Wow, this has been incredibly eye-opening. I'm starting to feel like I actually understand what's going on in this market. But before we wrap up part 2, I have one more question for you.
Sure. What's on your mind?
We've talked a lot about the economics and the practical stuff. But what about the human side of all this? What about the people who are getting priced out? Or the ones who are struggling to find a place to call home in this crazy competitive market?
That's a really important question, and one that deserves a deep dive all its own.
Maybe that's where we'll head next time. But for now, let's take a quick break. When we come back for part three, we'll wrap up our exploration of the Silicon Valley housing market with some final thoughts and key takeaways. And we're back for the final stretch of our deep dive into the Silicon Valley housing market. We've covered a lot of ground, from those sky-high prices to the wild strategies buyers, sellers, and investors are using. But before we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear your big picture perspective.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride. What really stands out to me is how incredibly dynamic this market is. It never sits still, always changing and reacting to everything, from what's happening in tech to those interest rates we talked about. It's like this fascinating little world that reflects all the big forces shaping our lives.
So true. It's like a high-stakes game where the rules are always in flux, but that's what makes it so interesting to follow. As we head toward the finish line here, any final thoughts for our listeners?
If there's one thing I hope people take away from this deep dive, it's that knowledge is key. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out, understanding how the Silicon Valley housing market works can make a huge difference.
Couldn't agree more. We've talked about how important research is, having a strategy, and being ready to adapt. Those are valuable lessons no matter what side of the market you're on.
Exactly. And one more thing I'd add. Don't be afraid to question those assumptions you might have.
Yeah.
We often hear about Silicon Valley as if it's this uniform bubble. But as we've seen, there are these micro trends and little quirks within different communities. Don't let any preconceived notions limit your understanding or your options.
Such a great point. It's all about looking past the headlines and digging a little deeper. And speaking of digging deeper, we touched on something earlier that I think deserves more attention. That human side of this housing market we were talking about.
Yet the impact on families, people who've lived there for years, and those who are struggling to afford a place, those are critical aspects that we need to keep talking about.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers and the strategies, but at the end of the day, the housing market is about people's lives and their hopes for the future.
It's about creating communities that work for everyone, that are sustainable and full of life. And that takes a much bigger approach, something that goes beyond just supply and demand.
Well said. That's a perfect note to end on. It reminds us that while the Silicon Valley housing market is unique, the challenges and opportunities it presents are really a reflection of what's happening in society as a whole.
Exactly. And as we figure out these complex issues, it's so important to remember that we're all in this together.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the Silicon Valley housing market.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you. Hopefully you found it helpful.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and hold on to those housing dreams.